is there an ancient Indian influence in Australia? So when we think about Australia, we think about, especially when Indians think about Australia, we think about cricket. We think about the Australian cricket team, and we think about the people of Australia as being European in origin and essentially English speaking in origin. So from the British Islands. So that's how we see the people of Australia. The fact is that the European presence in Australia dates back to the 1780s or thereabouts, plus or minus 10, 15 years. Okay, so that's where European influence in Australia begins. That's just how many years ago? That's like 250 years ago or 300 years ago at most. For the entirety of its history, Australia has been home to the indigenous Australian people, the Australian Aboriginal people, who have been present in Australia for at least 60,000 years. So these Australian Aboriginal people are the true natives of Australia. They are the true owners of that land, of that nation, of that continent. And after the European occupation of Australia, the Australian Aboriginal people were deprived of their rights. They were marginalized, and essentially they were reduced to the margins of society. Even today, they don't have too many rights. They live on the fringes of society. They have terrible conditions. They have suffered lots of atrocities for centuries. But these Australian Aborigines are the true natives of Australia. Now, if we look at the genetics of the Australian Aboriginal people, then we find a very interesting change around 5,000 years ago. So between 5,000 and 4,500 years ago, a new genetic signature entered the Australian Aboriginal lineages. And this is an Indian genetic signature. So about 5,000 to 4,500 years ago, the Australian Aboriginal people came in contact with Indians who had somehow managed to reach Australia. So let us take a look at the distance between India and Australia. This here is India, and Australia is all the way far to the south. That is thousands of kilometers. So how would Indians have reached Australia 5,000 years ago? So we're talking about the Harappan era of Indian civilization. That's when this contact happened. And just to clarify, before I go back into the map, to clarify, today, the indigenous people of Australia have about 10 to 12% of Indian genetics. So if you examine their DNA, about 10 to 12% of it is Indian in origin, and this change happened around 5,000 to 4,500 years ago. And other changes also happened at that time. The Australian wild dog, which is called the dingo, also appears for the first time in the Australian fossil record at the same time, around 5,000 years ago. And if you look at this dog, the Australian dingo, it looks just like the Indian dog, the standard issue Indian dog that you find on every street corner in India. The brownish, yellowish dog, medium sized, very intelligent. That is exactly what the Australian dingo is. So this DNA influx happened, and the Australian dingo also appeared at the same time. And at the same time, new tools have appeared in the Australian fossil and archaeological record, which were not present before that time. So new tools, new technology also appeared around this time. So there is unmistakable and undeniable hard evidence that Indians traveled all the way to Australia 4.5 or 5,000 years ago, and they assimilated in the Australian population, left behind their genetics, and their descendants are alive all across Australia today. And the other thing to note is that the Indian migrants to Australia did not attempt to impose Indian culture and languages upon the Australian people, because you see none of that in the Australian languages or culture today. So they harmoniously assimilated among the indigenous Australian people. Now let's again go back to the map. So take a look at how far Australia is from India. So if you can see the pointer of my mouse, the Indians who went there would either have had to cross the Indian Ocean by sea, which is an incredible naval journey, or they would have had to go by foot or by other means from present-day Myanmar to Thailand to Malaysia, jump across the ocean, the seas to Indonesia through various islands, and then cross over from Papua New Guinea or from other parts of Indonesia into northern Australia. So either way, it's an incredible journey, and we know that the people of ancient India were great seafarers. They had great naval technology. The Rig Veda, the world's oldest literature, which is around 8,000 years old at least, it makes references to ships with 100 oars. And we know very clearly that Indians had been traveling across the seas for a very long time. So it is not surprising to me that ancient Indians were able to make this voyage, this naval voyage, all the way to northern Australia, and they have spread their genetics there. So that is the story of the ancient Indian influence in Australia. It must have been an incredible journey. There's a story that we have lost. There's a piece of history, a monumental piece of history that is now lost to us. And we can use archaeology and genetics to reconstruct what happened, but it clearly happened. Indians went all the way to Australia almost 5,000 years ago. So that is the story of the ancient Indian influence in Australia 5,000 years ago. I don't think anyone knows about this because we are not taught about this.